Chapter 1. The island appeared first as an inky smudge on the horizon, beaded with pinholes of light against the greying sky. As the ferry ploughed on, carving its path through the waves, the land took form and seemed to rise out of the sea like the hump of a great creature yet to raise its head. Bright points arranged themselves into clusters, huddled into the bay at the foot of the cliff, though the intermittent sweep of the lighthouse remained separate at the furthest reach of the harbour wall. The only passenger on the deck leaned out, gripping the rail tighter with both hands, anchored by the smooth grain of the wood beneath her fingers. Doggedly, the ferry rose and fell, hurling up a cascade of spray each time it crested a wave and dropped away. Wind whipped her hair into salt strands that stung her lips. She wore a battered flying jacket and pulled up the collar against the damp as she planted her feet, swaying with the motion of the boat, determined to take it all in from here as they docked, and not through the smeared window of the passenger lounge downstairs, with its fug of wet coats and stewed tea. Outside, the wind tasted of petrol and brine. She pushed her fringe out of her face and almost laughed in disbelief when the noise of the engines fell away and the men in orange waterproofs began throwing their coils of rope and shouting orders at one another as the boat nosed a furrow through oily water to bump alongside the pier. 2 days of travelling and it was almost over. She tried not to think about the old saying that the journey mattered more than the arrival. She tried not to think about what she had left behind, thousands of miles away. The ferry terminus hardly warranted the name. There was a car park and one low pebble-dashed building, the word cafe flaking off a sign above the door. She edged down the gangplank, pushing her wheeled art case in front of her and yanking the large suitcase behind like two unwilling toddlers, a travel easel in its holder unwieldy under her arm. Each time it hit the rail as she turned to wrestle with one bag or other, she was grateful that now, in mid-October, the ferry was not crowded, so that at least she did not have to worry about how many of her fellow passengers she had maimed in the process of herding her luggage ashore. At the head of the slipway, she saw a man in a leather jacket, its zip straining over a comfortable paunch. He was holding a homemade cardboard sign that read, Zoe Adams. As soon as his eyes locked onto hers and met with recognition, he broke into a broad smile and started waving madly at her, as if he were trying to attract her attention through a crowd, though she was only yards away and the few remaining foot passengers had all dispersed. She smiled back, hesitant. He was around her own age, she thought, early 40s, with thinning blonde hair and a round, open face, cheeks reddened by island weather or a taste for drink, or perhaps both together. He approached her with an anxious smile.
Mrs. Adams?
She hesitated. She could have let it go, but there would be only more questions later on. Actually, it's Miss.
Hey?
Zoe tilted her head in apology. I'm not a Mrs.
Oh.
He looked afraid he had offended.
My mistake. You're no married then?
She made a non-committal noise and set down one of her cases so that she could stretch out a hand. You must be Mr. Drummond.
Mick, please.
He beamed again, grasping her fingers and shaking them with a vigor intended to convey the sincerity of his welcome.
I'm the one who's been sending all the emails.
He released her hand and held up the sign with a self-conscious laugh. The wind almost snatched it from his grip.
My wife's idea. I told her it's not as if there's going to be hundreds of them pouring off the boat, but she said it would spare you feeling lost when you first set foot here.
Zoe smiled. If only that were all it took. It was very thoughtful of her.
Aye, she's like that, Kay. You'll meet her. Here, let me take those.
He tucked the sign under his arm and hefted her cases into each hand, nodding across the car park to an old Land Rover, its flanks crusted with mud. Zoe looked back at the harbour as he loaded her bags into the trunk. Through the lit windows of the ferry, she could see the shapes of people cleaning, swinging plastic bags of trash, ready for the return trip, the boat garish in its brightness against the encroaching dark of sea and sky. The gulls shrieked their tireless warnings. Here, the rolling of the waves seemed louder and more insistent, as if the sea wanted to make sure you did not forget its presence. She wondered if she would grow used to that after a while. A faint wash of reddish light stained the line of the horizon, but it was too overcast for a proper sunset like those in the photographs. Still, there would be time.
Hop in, then.
Mick held the door open for her. For one panicked moment, she thought he expected her to drive before she realized she had made the usual mistake. That perverse habit of driving on the left. Perhaps she would get used to that in time, too. The quick flurry of palpitations subsided. Is it far to the house?
5 miles, give or take.
He glanced over his shoulder, shuffled his feet.
Look, it's been a long journey, I know, and you'll be tired, but we wondered if you'd like to come by the pub for a wee drink before I take you up to the house.
Zoe began a polite refusal, but he cut across her.
Thing is, we've music on tonight, local band. It's a thing we do on Thursdays, so there'll be a lot of folk out, and we thought, well, it was Kay's idea. She thought it would be nice for you to say hello while they're all in one place. Since you're staying a while, you know, only a wee glass.
He twisted his hands together and looked at his boots before raising his eyes briefly to hers, as if he were asking for a date.
She's dying to meet you,
he added.
They all are.
Zoe sucked in her cheeks. Christ, she was far from dying to meet them, whoever they were, quite the opposite. She felt grimy and dishevelled from the overnight flight, the 5-hour train journey, and 2 hours on the ferry. She probably didn't smell too fresh either, under all her layers. And the point was to be anonymous here, to slip quietly into a coastal house and be left alone. She had not come here to make friends. But it had been naive, she now realized, to imagine that a newcomer to a small community, out of season, would not immediately become a subject of gossip and speculation. If she was going to stay here a few weeks, it would be wise not to offend the locals on day one. I'm not really dressed for going out, she said, though the protest was half-hearted.
You're grand,
Mick said, giving her a cursory glance.
It's not as if they'll all be in dinner suits.
He clicked his seatbelt.
Just the one, and then I'll run you up to the house, I promise. We can leave all the bags in the car.
Zoe leaned her forehead against the window, the cold solidity of the glass reflecting her exhaustion back at her. Without makeup, the jet lag and all the sleepless nights of recent months were etched onto her face like a confession. Was that why she was so reluctant to go to the pub, she wondered? Plain old vanity? Was it that she didn't want to be judged by her new neighbours until she could at least brush her hair and paint some colour into her washed-out face? Of course it could be a scam. She would blithely go in for one drink, and when she came out there would be no sign of Mick or the car or her bags. But if she was going to think like that, the whole thing could be a scam, as Dan had repeatedly pointed out. All she had seen was a website, an amateurish one at that, and a few emails. Maybe the house didn't even exist. If that were the case, it was too late to worry about it now. She had already transferred the money. Sure, she said, forcing enthusiasm. Why not?
Oh, lovely. I wouldn't hear the last of it from Kate if we not given you a proper welcome.
Zoe could hear the relief in his voice as the engine belched into life.
You'll like it. They're a colourful crowd. I mean, it's not exactly the nightlife of New York,
he added, as if fearing he might have created false expectations.
But then I suppose you've come here to get away from all that.
I'm not from New York, Zoe said, watching the mournful lights of the cafe recede as he pulled away. Then, thinking she ought to offer something else, she added, Connecticut. You're not far off.
Oh, aye.
Mick turned out onto the main road.
Never been myself. America. I'd like to, mind. When the kids are older, maybe. Kay wants to go to Nashville. She's into all the country music and that, you know. Now me, I've a fancy for somewhere more rugged. Hiking, fishing, that sort of thing. I've always liked the idea of moving to Canada.
So does half my country right now, she muttered.
Aye, the great outdoors,
Mick continued, missing the point.
that's where I'm at home. Can't get my girls interested yet, though they're quite into animals and all that. We get otters up here. You'll maybe see some around the bay.
Zoe leaned against the window and let Mick fill the silence with his wilderness dreams. For as long as he was talking about himself or otters, he was not asking her questions. They passed through what she assumed was the main street of the town, a general store, a place that sold hardware, electronics, and fishing supplies, a tea room, a bookshop, a few vacant shop fronts, the windows opaque with milky swirls of whitewash, as if to veil their emptiness from public view. At the far end, the street broadened out into a triangular green with a war memorial in the center, a school playground on one side, and a small plain church opposite. Mick swung the Land Rover to the right, past the churchyard into a narrower lane. The cottages on each side lined up crookedly against one another, like bad teeth, but they looked snug, with the lights glowing warmly behind drawn curtains. Have you always lived here? She prompted when he seemed in danger of running out of talk. He slid her a sideways look, and she sensed that a certain wariness had descended.
Born and bred,
He said. She was not sure if the note in his voice was pride or resignation.
Got away as soon as I could, mind. All the young ones do. But my mother passed away 5 years back, and my dad couldn't manage the pub on his own. He was getting on, you know, so I came home, brought my wife and daughters with me.
He heaved a deep sigh.
Sometimes a place is in your marrow. It pulls you back. Nothing you can do about it.
Uh-huh, Zoe nodded. My grandmother came from this part of the world, actually.
Is that right?
He eyed her with greater approval.
So you've come in search of your roots?
Something like that. I guess my Scottish blood's pretty diluted by now. She married an Englishman. My mother grew up in Kent. I was born there, too.
I'd keep that quiet round here if I were you.
He winked.
You don't sound like you're from Kent.
We moved to the States when I was a kid. My dad's from Boston. She wrapped her arms around herself. The thought of her father speared her with a sudden pang of longing. No use thinking of that now. She forced a brightness into her voice, changing the subject. So, did the house always belong to your family? The one I'm staying in? Again, that slight hesitation, the flicker of a glance, as if he suspected her of trying to catch him out.
Aye.
It looked as if this was the extent of his answer, but as they approached a turning with a painted sign at the entrance, showing a white stag on the crest of a hill, he cleared his throat.
But it didn't come to me until my father passed on last year.
Oh, I'm sorry, Zoe said automatically. About your father.
Aye, well, he was 87 and still working more or less. That's no bad run.
Mick sniffed.
But he'd let the house go over the years. They all had. Took a lot of work to make it fit to live in. Don't get me wrong.
He turned to her with that same anxious expression.
It's all good as new. Better. I did most of the work myself. That's what I used to do down in Glasgow, you know, restore houses. It's lovely now, though I say so myself. Well, you'll have seen the photos on the website. They're not photoshopped or any of that.
He insisted, a touch defensive. It looks beautiful. You didn't want to keep it for your family home? He snapped his head round and his eyes narrowed. Then his face relaxed and he laughed, almost with relief.
Too far out for us. We stay here, above the pub. That way we're on hand if there's any problems, and the girls can walk to school in 5 minutes. That's the only reason,
he added, as if someone had suggested otherwise.
No sense in making life more complicated.
He indicated the building in front of them, a whitewashed inn of 3 stories with gabled windows in the roof. The car park outside was busy, and as he switched off the engine, Zoe heard music and laughter drifting through the clear air.
But if it's peace and quiet you're after, it'll be perfect for you.
He was trying too hard, Zoe thought. Perhaps there was something wrong with the house after all. It had looked so idyllic on the website, eccentric, as if the original architect had thrown at it all the excesses of the Victorian Gothic and hoped for the best. From the pictures she had seen, the interior was tastefully restored and minimally furnished, but what had really hooked her was the light. The photographs had been taken in summer, but even in sunshine there was a bleakness to the island's beauty that had whispered to her, stark bars of cloud lending shadow and depth to the sky. A veranda ran around the west and south sides of the house, overlooking an empty strand of sand and shingle, marked only by coarse clumps of seagrass, tapering down to a small bay that gave on to the vast silvered expanse of the Atlantic. The house was set a little way back from the beach, built into the slope of the cliff at its shallowest point, while a ridge of rock rose up behind, as if to protect it from prying eyes. She had noticed the quality of the light with a painter's eye, and known with some instinct deeper than thought that she needed to wake under that sky, to the sound of that empty ocean and the seabirds that wheeled and screamed above it, if she was ever going to find her way back. Whether some ancestral tug in the blood had drawn her there, she could not say. She had only felt a certainty on seeing the house that had eluded her for months, the knowledge that it was meant for her. "Peace and quiet is absolutely what I want," she said, but with a smile so as not to seem too antisocial. Mick opened his door, then turned back to her.
"The thing is, Mrs. Adams, Zoe."
He chewed his lip, unsure how to continue.
"There's a lot of history to this place, legends and so on, and a lot of families have been here for generations, so people have their superstitions, you know. Plenty of folk here have barely been off the island."
Zoe nodded. "I guess that's part of the charm."
"Aye, but—"
He looked uneasy.
"It's only if you hear people telling tall tales, as they like to do with a drop of whiskey inside 'em, pay them no mind. Fishermen's yarns, old wives' gossip, that's all it is."
"Oh, I love all those folk tales. My grandmother used to tell them when we were kids, selkies and giants and whatever." As soon as she'd said the words, she regretted them, picturing herself trapped in a smoky corner by some ancient mariner.
"As long as you know that's all they are, bits of fun, tease the incomers."
Mick smiled back, but he did not look reassured.
"Come on then, you must be gasping for a drink."
The warmth of the pub hit her face like a blast from a subway vent, thick and yeasty, homely smelling. Wood smoke and winter food, stews, hot pastry and mulled cider. A wave of sound broke over her at the same time, a fast and furious jig from the band, accompanied by raucous singing, foot stamping and the banging of beer mugs, so that for an instant Zoe felt overwhelmed by the force of it, the noise and heat and smell of so many people crammed into a lounge bar designed for half their number. She stood very still, one hand to her temple, as if her head were fragile as an eggshell, and closed her eyes as the weight of her jet lag settled inside her skull. When she opened them, every head had swiveled to stare at her. She allowed her gaze to travel the room, taking in the questioning faces, no hostility in them, as far as she could see. Most had not even missed a breath in their singing, and felt her own expression freeze into a tight little smile, fearful of offending. She cast around for Mick with a flutter of alarm, until she realized he had flipped open the bar and taken up a position of natural authority behind it. He beckoned her over and pushed a heavy crystal tumbler across the polished wood. A generous measure of Scotch glowed honey gold, with no ice.
"Get this down you,"
he said in a low voice.
"Put some colour in your cheeks."
Zoe lifted the glass to her mouth and breathed in peat and smoke, ancient scents, the land itself. The heat slid down her throat and uncurled through her limbs. Behind her eyes the headache intensified briefly, then began to melt away. She set the glass down on the bar, and Mick immediately refilled it with a wink.
"That's my key there,"
he said, nodding to the makeshift stage where the band were building to a crescendo. Zoe turned to look. The singer was a buxom woman, dressed younger than her age, in drapey black skirts and a black lace top, her long pink hair bright and defiant. She sang with her eyes closed, a fist wrapped around the microphone, one foot in floral Doc Martens, pounding the stage to the beats of the Bowerin, her voice bluesy and hard-edged, smoke and whiskey. Though Zoe could not make out the words, she surmised from the ferocity of the singing that it was some kind of nationalist rebel song, and that the anger soaked through its lyrics was still keenly felt by a good many of the patrons. The rest of the band were men, all, apart from the young fiddle player, well into middle age, with grey hair pulled back into ponytails and grizzled beards, leather waistcoats and cowboy boots. There was an accordion, a penny whistle, and a guitar as well as the Bowerin and the violin. The music sounded vaguely familiar, the kind she had heard on a loop in Irish bars in Boston and New York, but here it did not feel manufactured for tourists. The musicians played with their eyes closed, as if every note mattered. The rebel song ended in a burst of cheering and applause, but the band did not even pause to acknowledge it. Instead, the woman launched into a wild and wrenching lament, accompanied only by the violin and the heavy heartbeat of the drum. The room stilled to a reverent hush as her voice soared to the blackened rafters, transformed now into a fluting, otherworldly alto, holding tremulous notes that made goosebumps prickle along Zoe's arms and the back of her neck. Though she did not understand the strange language, she could not miss the heart cry in the music, a grief that seemed centuries old. Looking around, she saw old men with tears running down their faces, mouthing the words to themselves. The woman's voice faded out, and the young fiddle player stepped forward for a solo, his lips pressed tightly together, slender fingers moving nimbly over the strings, brow furrowed behind the long fringe that fell over his face. Zoe sipped her second whiskey and experienced a sudden urge to reach forward and brush it out of his eyes, the way she would with Caleb when he was bent over his iPad, absorbed in whatever animation he was making, oblivious to everything. She became aware that Mick was leaning over the bar behind her, a dishcloth pressed between his clasped hands. "She has an incredible voice," Zoe realized she was expected to comment.
"She's something, isn't she?"
Mick said, not taking his eyes off his wife. That glimpse of tender pride caused Zoe to flinch briefly. She remembered seeing the same expression on Dan's face at the first exhibition she had invited him to when they started dating, admiration of her talent and the thrill of being allowed to claim some share in it. She could not remember when he had last looked at her like that. At the end of the song, the band set down their instruments and announced a break. Around the bar, the hum of conversation resumed. Glances once more directed openly at her, murmured observations that made no effort to disguise the fact that she was the subject. The woman with the pink hair sprang down and pressed her way across the bar, scattering smiles to left and right. She stopped breathlessly and caught Zoe's hand between both of hers.
"Zoe, we're so glad you're here. I'm Kay Drummond. I hope he's got you a drink. Top her up there, Michael, will ye? You're our guest tonight. Are ye hungry?"
Zoe shook her head. If she had been hungry, the whiskey had blunted all memory of it. Kay looked up at her with anxious eyes. Though her figure was voluptuous, her face was delicate, almost elfin, the wide blue eyes rimmed with black kohl, her rosebud mouth painted the same shade of fuchsia as her hair. Zoe guessed her to be in her late 30s. She wore large silver rings on every finger, so that Zoe felt she was being clasped by armored gauntlets. "That was a beautiful song just now," she said.
"Oh, aye, thanks."
Kay beamed, her eyes shining.
"It's an old one. Everyone around here remembers their granny singing it."
"What does it mean?"
"Oh, they're awful depressing. It's about a woman who loses her love to the sea and drowns herself of a broken heart. Most of them are, if they're not about the clearances. People have long memories up here. Have you come to paint? I said to Mick we could have a wee show here in the pub if you wanted. Folk might like to see 'em. They might even buy one if they weren't too."
She made a knowing face and rubbed her thumb and forefinger together. "Oh, that's kind, but..." Zoe felt herself growing flustered. I hadn't thought of selling. I'm a little out of practice. I'm here to find my way back to it, I suppose.
Well, you let us know,
Kay said, undeterred.
It's not like we're experts. They could be total shite, we wouldn't know any different.
She broke into peals of laughter and flicked Zoe on the arm with the back of her hand.
I'm only messing with you. I'm sure they're no shite. You'd buy one, wouldn't you, Ed?
She nudged the young man next to her, the fiddle player, in the ribs. He turned from the bar and gave Zoe a shy smile from under his fringe. He wore large tortoiseshell glasses that reflected the light, making it hard to see his eyes clearly.
Buy what? One of Zoe's paintings.
Oh, what are they of? I haven't done any yet, Zoe said, smiling to ease his embarrassment. Well, not here, but I guess I paint landscapes. Or I used to. Kind of impressionistic, not very original. She added with an awkward laugh. He shrugged. Everyone likes a landscape, don't they? I mean, at least you know what it is. People don't stand around in galleries arguing about what a landscape means, right? Oh, they do, Zoe almost said, but stopped herself. Condescension would not be a good look. The boy took off his glasses and rubbed them on the hem of his shirt. His face appeared soft and exposed without them. A pint of dark beer was slopped down on the bar top in front of him. She glanced up and caught the eye of the barmaid, a thick-set girl of about 18, with heavy makeup, a top that was too tight to flutter, and dyed black hair scraped into a messy topknot, pulling her small features taut under ruthlessly plucked brows. She looked at Zoe with evident disdain, even when Zoe ventured a smile.
Cheers, Arnick.
The boy, Ed, replaced his glasses, took a sip from the top of his pint, and fished in his pocket for coins with the other hand. She noticed he did not look at the girl behind the bar. Instead, he cocked his head towards Zoe. Can I get you a drink? She glanced down at her glass. While her back had been turned, it had magically acquired another 2 fingers of scotch. She would have to take it easy. Already a gentle numbness had begun spreading up the side of her face, warm and comforting, as her head was growing lighter. I'm good, thanks. She hesitated. The barmaid continued to watch her. I'd take one of those, though. She nodded towards the open breast pocket of his shirt, where a pack of Marlboro Lights nosed out. As soon as she'd asked, she wondered why she'd done it. She hadn't smoked for over a decade, not since before she was pregnant with Caleb. She hadn't even been aware that she'd missed it. She had a sudden memory of the first day of college, self-consciously lighting a cigarette almost as soon as her parents had driven away, because, for the first time, there was no one who knew her, and she was at liberty to try out a new version of herself, one less timid and constrained by expectations. Perhaps this was the same thing, 25 years on. Dan would be appalled. She supposed that was precisely why she had asked.
Of course.
The boy picked up his pint and patted the cigarettes in his pocket.
We'll have to go out the back.
As she turned back for her drink, Zoe saw the look of naked hostility on the barmaid's flat face and realized, too late, that she might unwittingly have stepped on someone's toes. I don't really smoke, she said by way of apology, as the boy held open a door at the side of the bar and led her through to a paved courtyard that opened onto a grassy area with picnic tables overlooking a low wall. Beyond this, some way below them, lay the vast black expanse of the sea.
Nor do I.
He flipped open the pack and offered it to her, glancing around as he did so. At least, not where the children might see me. She looked at him surprised. He could not be past his early 20s. People started younger in the country, she supposed. How many kids do you have?
11.
He left a significant pause, grinning at her expression. Youngest 4, oldest nearly 12. I'm the schoolteacher here. Oh, Zoe laughed to show that she had fallen for the joke. She regarded him with a new curiosity. Just you? Just me. There's only one class. The older kids take the ferry to the mainland and board during the week. Wow. How long have you been here?
Since Christmas. The previous teacher had to retire on health grounds. They needed someone quickly. I was lucky. It was my first job out of college.
He gave a diffident smile and struck a match, cupping his hands around the flame as he brought it to the tip of her cigarette. He leaned in close enough for her to see the fine dusting of freckles over the bridge of his nose. Behind his glasses, his lashes were so long they brushed the lenses, and darker than his hair. He sensed her looking and raised his eyes. A gust of wind snuffed out the flame before it could make contact.
What made you choose somewhere so remote?
She asked quietly, as he threw down the burnt match and struck another.
I could ask you the same thing,
he said. He laughed as he said it, but she glimpsed a flash of wariness in his eyes. The match guttered out and he dropped it with a soft curse.
Running away,
said a firm voice behind them. Zoe jumped, as if caught in a forbidden act. She whipped around to see a man seated on a bench by the door, against the wall of the pub, almost hidden by shadows. He spoke through a pipe clamped comfortably between his teeth. A black Labrador lay at his feet, half under the bench, so dark its hindquarters seemed to disappear.
Everyone who comes here is trying to escape from something,
he repeated, amusement lighting his eyes.
And those who were born here dream of running away.
He rubbed his neat white beard and smiled, as if they were all included in a private joke.
Here, Edward.
He held out a silver Zippo.
You'll be there all night with this wind.
The boy stepped forward to take the lighter.
What are you running from then, Professor?
The older man considered.
History,
he said after a pause. His gaze rested on Zoe.
And you must be the artist from America. We've been looking forward to meeting you.
He did not speak with a local accent, but in the rich, sonorous voice of an English stage actor. A reassuring voice, Zoe thought. She inclined her head.
Zoe Adams. Charles Joseph.
He held out a hand, though he didn't get up, obliging her to cross to him so that he could shake hers with a brisk grip. Even in the half-light, she could see that his face was tanned and weathered, his eyes a sharp ice blue. He could have been anywhere between 50 and 80.
And this is Horace, named for the poet. He has a decidedly satirical glint.
The dog raised its eyebrows and thumped its tail once in acknowledgement. Are you a professor of history, then? She asked, to turn the conversation away from herself.
He laughed. I'm afraid this young man is flattering me, or mocking me, I'm never sure which. I have been a university teacher in my time, it's true, though I never held tenure, never stayed anywhere long enough.
Everyone calls him the professor, though, Edward said, cracking the Zippo into life. Zoe held her cigarette to the flame, inhaled and coughed violently as her head spun. He's our local historian. Anything you want to know about the island, he's your man.